January 25th, 1944. Deep inside a reinforced concrete bunker on the Kwajalein Atoll, Japanese Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama sits quietly, writing in his diary. He will never finish his sentence. With a sudden, deafening roar, a massive American naval artillery shell pierces the heavy concrete roof, killing the commander instantly. This strike doesn't happen during the heat of an assault. It happens 6 full days before the main American amphibious invasion even begins. Akiyama's abrupt death is just the violent prelude to what is about to become one of the most mechanically perfect, relentlessly efficient victories in the history of the Pacific War. When the smoke finally clears over the shattered remnants of the atoll in early February, the scale of the American triumph is almost impossible to comprehend. The bombardment that eliminated Admiral Akiyama was merely the opening note of a devastating, meticulously orchestrated symphony of destruction. Out of a total garrison of nearly 8,000 men, approximately 7,870 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and mobilized laborers are completely wiped out. The number of prisoners taken is statistically insignificant, a handful of dazed survivors pulled from the blasted concrete and scorched coral. The entire island defense network has been systematically erased from existence. The cost of this conquest for the United States? Roughly 372 American lives. In the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of the Pacific War, this casualty ratio is staggering. To the American commanders reading the post-action reports back in Hawaii and Washington, Kwajalein looks like an absolute masterpiece. It stands as the ultimate vindication of their rapidly evolving amphibious doctrine. It is a flawless execution of overwhelming firepower, precise timing, and unyielding logistical supremacy. On paper, it is a masterclass in how to take a heavily fortified island, proving that the American military machine can work exactly as designed. But beneath the surface of this immaculate victory lies a terrifying paradox. The United States didn't just defeat the Japanese garrison at Kwajalein. They dismantled it so thoroughly and so clinically that they completely exposed the fatal structural flaws in Japan's entire island defense strategy. By executing the perfect coastal assault, the American military inadvertently handed their enemy the most valuable lesson of the war. The absolute destruction of the atoll was supposed to serve as a reliable template for a quicker, more decisive march to Tokyo. Instead, it became a deadly strategic catalyst. Why did the most perfect American victory of the Pacific Theater directly teach the Japanese military how to completely rewrite their defensive doctrine and how to slaughter Americans at a vastly higher, agonizingly slower rate in the dark battles yet to come? To comprehend the deadly paradox of Kwajalein, one must first understand the trauma that created it. Flawless military execution is rarely the product of sudden genius. It is almost always forged in the brutal fires of catastrophic failure. To understand why the American military machine operated with such terrifying mechanical perfection in the Marshall Islands, it is necessary to look back just 10 weeks prior, to November 1943. The target was Batio, a bird-shaped speck of coral in the Tarawa Atoll, less than 3 miles long and barely 800 yards wide. This was to be the first major American amphibious assault of the Central Pacific Drive. The plan to take the island was built on a foundation of theoretical assumptions and dangerous optimism. The prevailing belief among naval planners was that the sheer tonnage of high explosives could solve the complex problem of island defenses. The strategy seemed straightforward: saturate the tiny landmass with overwhelming naval gunfire, sweep the beaches completely clear of resistance, and simply walk the infantry ashore. At dawn on November 20th, the United States Navy delivered what was, at the time, the heaviest concentrated naval bombardment in history. For approximately 2.5 hours, American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded the tiny island. The volume of fire was so intense that the entire landmass seemed to disappear beneath a boiling, violently churning cloud of coral dust and black smoke. To the Marines watching from the transport ships miles offshore, it seemed physically impossible that any human being could survive the inferno. But the bombardment was fundamentally flawed. It was brutally brief, allowing the deeply entrenched Japanese defenders to simply endure the shock and wait for the barrage to lift. More critically, the Navy had utilized armor-piercing shells, munitions specifically designed to puncture the heavy steel hulls of enemy warships. When these delayed fuse shells struck the deep, sand-covered bunkers and palm log barricades of Batio, they often buried themselves deep in the soft coral and detonated harmlessly underground, leaving the heavy concrete structures above them completely intact. As the naval guns fell silent, the first wave of American landing craft began their run toward the beach. This is where theoretical planning violently collided with the unforgiving reality of Pacific geography. Surrounding Baishio was a shallow, fringing coral reef, extending hundreds of yards out from the shoreline. To cross this jagged barrier, the standard American landing craft, the wooden, flat-bottomed Higgins boats, officially designated as LCVPs, required at least 4 feet of water clearance. The planners back in Hawaii were aware of the reef. They had studied century-old tidal charts and consulted former colonial administrators who had lived in the region. They were explicitly warned about a local oceanic phenomenon known as a dodging tide, an unpredictable neap tide that might halt the flow of water and leave the reef covered by only a foot or two of ocean. The command staff acknowledged the risk, but driven by rigid operational timetables and the intense strategic pressure to maintain offensive momentum, they accepted it. They gambled that the water would be just deep enough on the morning of the assault. They lost the gamble. As the Higgins boat surged forward toward the beaches, the bottoms of the landing craft slammed hard into the abrasive coral, grinding to a violent, jarring halt. They were still hundreds of yards away from the shore. The tide was far too low. The entire assault wave was hopelessly stuck on the edge of the reef. Suddenly, the smoke cleared over Baishio, and the reality of the failed naval bombardment became terrifyingly clear. The Japanese bunkers were not destroyed. The coastal defense guns were fully operational. The Japanese defensive doctrine at this stage of the war was absolute and uncompromising. Destroy the enemy at the water's edge. Stop the invasion on the beaches before the attackers can establish a viable foothold. From inside their surviving concrete pillboxes and reinforced blockhouses, the Japanese defenders opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, and anti-boat artillery swept the exposed reef in a precise, interlocking grid of flying steel. The stranded Marines trapped in the Higgins boats had only one choice. They had to drop the heavy steel ramps of their landing craft, step out into the chest-deep water, and begin to wade forward. It was a slow, agonizing movement through the heavy surf. Weighed down by heavy packs, waterlogged radios, and ammunition, the Marines had absolutely no cover for 500 to 800 yards. The geometry of the trap was inescapable. The Japanese machine gunners inside the bunkers did not even need to aim at individual men. They simply locked their heavy weapons into fixed firing lanes, just inches above the surface of the water, and held down the triggers. For 76 hours, combat raged across a patch of sand smaller than Central Park. The fighting quickly degenerated into point-blank, bunker-by-bunker elimination, relying on flamethrowers and satchel charges. By the time the island was finally declared secure, the human cost was staggering. Over 1,000 American Marines and sailors were dead. More than 2,000 were heavily wounded. The density of casualties, the sheer number of men killed per square yard of ground, was entirely unprecedented in American military history. Almost the entire Japanese garrison of nearly 4,700 men had fought to the death. But the trauma of Tarawa did not remain confined to the remote waters of the Pacific. For the first time in the war, the unvarnished, horrifying reality of the battlefield reached the American home front. Journalists who had waded ashore alongside the Marines sent back harrowing, unfiltered accounts of the slaughter on the reef. Soon after, the photographs and newsreels arrived. Images of dead American boys, half submerged in the tide, rolling gently against the coral, their bodies clustered around shattered, abandoned landing craft. The visual impact on the American public was profound. There was widespread shock, followed immediately by fierce political anger. The nation was entirely unprepared for this level of concentrated loss in such a short window of time. The outrage quickly traveled up the chain of command, echoing through the halls of Congress and shaking the highest levels of the War Department in Washington. Senators demanded immediate investigations. Newspaper editorials openly questioned the competence of the naval leadership, asking loudly why American lives were being thrown away in frontal assaults on insignificant strips of sand. The immense public and political pressure crystallized into a singular, undeniable mandate for the military establishment. A disaster like Tarawa must never happen again. If an island that small cost over 1,000 American lives, the projected mathematics of an island-hopping campaign reaching all the way to the Japanese home islands would result in a death toll numbering in the hundreds of thousands, or even millions. The war effort itself would become politically and socially unsustainable. The bloody beaches of Baishio forced a hard, immediate halt to American operational thinking. The Pacific strategy was suddenly under intense, unforgiving scrutiny. The pressure was no longer merely about defeating the enemy. It was about defeating the enemy efficiently, mechanically, and without the devastating, highly visible losses of November 1943. This immense burden fell directly onto the shoulders of Admiral Chester Nimitz and his planning staff in Hawaii. The time for theoretical assumptions and dangerous gambles on tides was permanently over. The commanders knew their next target was the Kwajalein Atoll, but before a single ship could sail, and before a single operational order for the next invasion could be drafted, the American military had to retreat from the beaches and step into their command rooms. They had to mercilessly dissect the nightmare of Tarawa, isolate every single tactical error, and completely reinvent their approach to amphibious warfare. In the early weeks of December 1943, the atmosphere inside Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters at Makalapa Crater, overlooking Pearl Harbor, was not one of simple mourning. It was a cold, forensic dissection. The officers gathered around the long wooden tables were not looking at memorials. They were studying after-action reports, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and the operational logs of the Tarawa landing. Every commander in the room understood that the methods used in November were fundamentally broken. To survive the Central Pacific Drive, the United States Navy and the Marine Corps had to strip their amphibious doctrine down to its atomic elements and rebuild it from scratch. The first element on the table was the tide. At Tarawa, the entire landing schedule had been built on hopeful guesswork and century-old colonial charts. Nimitz's staff vowed that no American soldier would ever again be ordered to charge across an unknown reef. Planners turned to the newly expanded Amphibious Reconnaissance Company and advanced submarine patrols. For weeks leading up to the Marshall Islands campaign, American submarines like the USS Nautilus and Corvina slipped into enemy waters, launching rubber rafts under the cover of darkness. Scouts physically measured the depth of the water over the reefs, tested the currents, and brought back samples of the coral. Geography was no longer treated as an uncontrollable hazard. It was treated as a mathematical problem that required an exact solution before the transport ships even left port. The second, more glaring failure was the naval bombardment. 2.5 hours of armor-piercing shells had produced impressive smoke clouds at Tarawa, but left the concrete command posts and sand-covered bunkers almost completely untouched. In the planning rooms at Pearl Harbor, the duration and composition of naval gunfire were completely overhauled. For Kwajalein, the naval bombardment would not be measured in hours, it would be measured in days. Planners drafted a schedule for 3 consecutive days of relentless, systematic shelling prior to the main infantry landing. More importantly, they changed the ammunition. Warships were ordered to leave their delayed fuse armor-piercing rounds in the magazines and load high-capacity, thin-walled fragmentation and blast shells, munitions designed to detonate on contact, shatter concrete, and tear away the protective layers of sand and palm logs. Yet even the heaviest naval guns could not eliminate every bunker from offshore. The planners realized that to destroy an entrenched garrison, they needed heavy, direct-fire land artillery operating before the infantry hit the primary beaches. Studying the unique geography of the Kwajalein Atoll, which consisted of nearly 100 small islets surrounding a massive central lagoon, Nimitz's tacticians devised a new operational sequence. Instead of sailing straight for the fortified main islands of Kwajalein and Roy Namur, the assault force would seize the small, undefended islets flanking the narrow passes on D-Day-1. Once these tiny strips of sand were secured, Army and Marine artillery battalions would immediately land dozens of 105mm and 155mm howitzers. When the main landing began the following morning, the advancing troops would be supported not just by firing ships at sea, but by a massive stationary artillery base, pouring direct, point-blank fire across the lagoon. Then came the mechanical fix for the fatal coral reef. The flat-bottomed wooden Higgins boats had proven to be death traps when the water ran shallow. The solution was the LVT, the Landing Vehicle Tract, known to the troops as the Alligator or the Amtrak. At Tarawa, only a small handful of these unarmored rescue vehicles had been available, and they had been used primarily to haul supplies or ferry wounded men. Now, the War Department ordered a massive acceleration in production and a complete shift in tactical purpose. Planners demanded that every single assault wave at Kwajalein be carried exclusively inside newly designed armored LVTs. Equipped with continuous tank treads, these amphibious vehicles could swim through the deep ocean surf, climb directly up onto the jagged coral reef, crawl across the dry stone without stopping, and deliver the infantry straight onto the dry sand of the beach. Finally, The entire assault plan was sharpened by one invisible weapon: signal intelligence. Deep inside the basement of the 14th Naval District building at Pearl Harbor, the codebreakers of Hypo, now integrated into the broader Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, had made critical breakthroughs in decrypting the Imperial Japanese Navy's operational codes. As Nimitz's staff drafted the assault maps, they were not guessing at enemy strength. Decrypted radio dispatches revealed the exact troop concentrations across the Marshall Islands. The Americans knew where the garrison was positioned, they knew which supply ships had been sunk, and they knew precisely how many weapons were waiting for them. By the end of January 1944, the forensic dissection of November's failure was complete. Every bloody mistake made at Tarawa had been converted into a specific mechanical countermeasure. The Pacific Fleet had assembled the largest amphibious force yet seen in the war, nearly 300 ships and 84,000 assault troops, all governed by a brand new, meticulously calculated doctrine of destruction. Yet doctrine remains nothing more than theory until it meets enemy steel. As the massive invasion armada converged on the Marshall Islands in the final days of January, the entire command staff waited in tense silence to see if their redesigned war machine would function as planned, or if another reef was waiting to tear it apart. While the American command staff stared at their operational maps in the final days of January 1944, holding their collective breath to see if the mechanical fixes devised in Pearl Harbor would actually survive contact with the enemy, the men waiting on the receiving end of this redesigned war machine were living a quiet, agonizing lie. Kwajalein Atoll, the administrative and military heart of the Marshall Islands, projected a formidable illusion of imperial strength. From the outside, it appeared to be an impregnable fortress anchoring the outer perimeter of the Japanese Empire. But deep inside the heavily reinforced concrete command bunker on Kwajalein Island, Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama, the commander of the 6th Base Force, understood the terrifying reality of his situation. He had recently received a series of highly classified, deeply classified strategic directives originating from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. These encrypted transmissions outlined a fundamental, catastrophic shift in Japan's overall war strategy. In the autumn of 1943, recognizing the devastating attrition of their naval and air forces in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the Japanese High Command had formally drawn a new strategic line across the Pacific. It was officially designated as the Zettai Kokubo-ken, the absolute national defense sphere. This invisible boundary stretched from the Kuril Islands in the north, ran down through the Marianas, and anchored itself in the Carolines and western New Guinea. Everything inside this line was to be defended with the full, mobilized might of the Japanese military. But the Marshall Islands, including Kwajalein, sat hundreds of miles to the east of this new perimeter. Admiral Akiyama read the stark, bureaucratic language of the directives and instantly decoded their true meaning. The combined fleet, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy resting at anchor in Truk Lagoon, was not going to sortie to save them. There would be no dramatic naval rescue, no massive reinforcement convoys, and no air armadas sweeping out of the west to drive the Americans back into the sea. The Marshall Islands had been administratively redefined as an expendable breakwater. Akiyama and his men were expected to fight, to bleed the Americans, to delay the inevitable advance, and ultimately, to die in place. The Admiral locked these decrypts away in his safe. He made a conscious, heavy decision to carry this psychological burden entirely alone. He did not issue a broadcast to his garrison informing them that they had been abandoned by their own government. Instead, he maintained strict military discipline, ordered the daily rationing of supplies, and commanded his men to continue pouring concrete and filling sandbags, projecting a hollow confidence to a garrison that was already written off as a total loss by the men in Tokyo. The tragedy of this deception was magnified by the sheer composition of the garrison that Akiyama commanded. On paper, American intelligence estimates had flagged the Kwajalein Atoll as a heavily defended objective, noting the presence of nearly 8,000 Japanese personnel scattered across the dual targets of Kwajalein Island in the south and the twin islands of Roy Namur in the north. 8,000 men sounded like a massive, seasoned combat force, a wall of seasoned infantry capable of turning the beaches into a slaughterhouse. But the reality on the ground was starkly different. The Japanese defenders were not the elite, battle-hardened infantry regiments that had swept across Malaya and the Philippines in the early days of the war. They were a fragile, disjointed assembly of specialized support staff trapped on a coral reef with nowhere to go. More than half of the 8,000 men waiting for the American Armada were aviation mechanics, ground crewmen, radio operators, administrative clerks, and naval supply personnel attached to the 22nd and 24th Air Flotillas. These were men whose military training was dedicated to calibrating the intricate radial engines of Mitsubishi Zero fighters and repairing the aluminum fuselages of twin-engine bombers. They were not trained for close-quarters infantry combat. As the American blockade tightened in late 1943, severing the flow of replacement aircraft and aviation fuel, these highly skilled technicians were abruptly repurposed. They were handed standard-issue Arisaka Type 38 bolt-action rifles, given rudimentary instructions on how to affix a bayonet, and ordered to dig anti-tank trenches in the unforgiving coral rock. They were mechanics told to act like infantrymen, commanded to hold the line against the most heavily armed amphibious force on the planet. Alongside these displaced mechanics were thousands of Korean forced laborers belonging to the 111th Pioneers and various naval construction battalions. These men had been systematically conscripted from their homes across the Sea of Japan, loaded into the dark, stifling holds of transport ships, and deposited onto the blazing equatorial sands of the Marshalls. They were unarmed, untrained, and deeply terrified. Their daily existence was a grueling cycle of hard manual labor beneath the relentless tropical sun, forced to mix concrete using corrosive seawater and drag heavy, freshly cut coconut logs across the beaches to construct the very bunkers they would soon be ordered to die in. As the threat of the American invasion loomed larger with each passing week of January, the Japanese officers integrated these laborers into the defensive plan, issuing them bamboo spears, sharpened farming implements, or simply ordering them to carry ammunition for the few operational machine guns. This was the true face of the Kwajalein garrison, a stranded, desperate workforce commanded by a silent admiral, bound together by a fatalistic order to defend a tiny strip of sand to the absolute bitter end. But the most catastrophic vulnerability of the Japanese position on Kwajalein was not the lack of reinforcements or the improvised nature of the infantry. It was a fatal, irreversible flaw in their tactical geometry. The Japanese defensive doctrine implemented in the Marshall Islands was strictly dictated by the lessons of the past, specifically the operational manuals drafted before the disaster at Tarawa had been fully understood in Tokyo. The doctrine was known as Mizugiwa Saksen, the strategy of defense at the water's edge. The underlying philosophy was brutally simple. An amphibious assault is at its most vulnerable at the exact moment the troops attempt to transition from the ocean to the land. Therefore, all available combat power, all heavy weapons, and all concrete fortifications must be pushed to the extreme outer perimeter of the island, facing directly out into the ocean surf. The geography of the Kwajalein Atoll forced the Japanese engineers to take this doctrine to its absolute absurd extreme. Kwajalein is the world's largest coral atoll, a massive lagoon surrounded by a thin necklace of tiny, fragmented islands. Kwajalein Island itself, situated at the southern tip of the atoll, is shaped like a long, curving crescent. It stretches for roughly 2.5 miles in length, but it is incredibly, almost impossibly narrow. At its widest point, the island measures a mere 800 yards across. In some places, it is less than 300 yards from the crashing waves of the ocean to the calm, turquoise waters of the lagoon. Because of this severe geographical constraint, the Japanese defensive planners possessed absolutely no spatial depth. They could not build a layered, defense-in-depth system. There were no dense jungles to fall back into, no hidden mountain ridges to fortify, no complex network of inland valleys where reserves could be hidden from naval gunfire. They had to place everything on the front porch. They poured their concrete pillboxes, installed their 8-centimeter dual-purpose naval guns, and dug their twin 13mm heavy machine gun nests directly into the sand on the immediate shoreline, with the firing slits looking out over the jagged coral reef. They concentrated 100% of their tactical strength in a single, shallow ribbon of fortifications. It was a one-dimensional defense, a glass wall facing the sea. The Japanese commanders surveyed their work and felt a grim sense of security. They looked out at the fringing reef, measuring the depth of the water, and calculated that the heavy, flat-bottomed American Higgins boats would inevitably grind to a halt hundreds of yards offshore. They expected the Americans to be trapped on the coral, forced to wade through chest-deep water directly into the interlocking arcs of Japanese machine gun fire, exactly as they had done at Tarawa. They had built a perfect machine to defeat an American assault from 1943. They had no idea they were about to face the American war machine of 1944. On the morning of January 29, 1944, the tropical horizon surrounding the Kwajalein Atoll darkened with the silhouettes of the United States Fifth Fleet. The redesigned American juggernaut had finally arrived, initiating Operation Flintlock. The skies erupted as the naval bombardment commenced, completely shattering the quiet isolation of the garrison. But this was not the brief, furious 2.5-hour barrage that had doomed the Marines at Batio. The American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers settled into a cold, methodical rhythm, anchoring themselves in offshore firing positions and unleashing a relentless 3-day tempest of high explosives. And the nature of the explosives had changed. The delayed fuse armor-piercing shells were gone. In their place, the naval gunners loaded high-capacity blast shells. When these massive projectiles struck the Japanese defensive line, they did not bury themselves harmlessly in the sand. They detonated on contact with terrifying concussive force, instantly vaporizing the layers of sand and coral rock, exposing the heavy palm logs, and systematically fracturing the thick concrete of the Japanese blockhouses. For 3 days, the garrison was subjected to an earth-shattering mechanical earthquake, deafened by the constant roar of the guns, choked by thick clouds of pulverized coral dust, and pinned down in their shallow bunkers. Yet despite the catastrophic damage being inflicted from the sea, the true masterstroke of the new American doctrine was not merely the sheer volume of naval gunfire. It was a brilliant, devastating manipulation of battlefield geometry. Admiral Nimitz's planning staff, having meticulously studied the aerial reconnaissance photographs of the atoll, recognized that the Japanese had focused all their defensive energy on facing the open ocean. They realized that a frontal assault directly into the teeth of those fortifications, even damaged ones, would still cost American lives. So they decided to completely rewrite the rules of engagement. On January 31st, officially designated as D-Day-1, the main American infantry force did not sail toward the heavily defended beaches of Kwajalein Island. Instead, elements of the 7th Infantry Division aimed their landing craft at a cluster of tiny, virtually undefended islets located just a few miles to the northwest, islands the Americans had given code names like Carlson, Carlos, and Carter. Moving with aggressive speed, the infantry secured these small patches of sand with minimal resistance. Within hours, specialized artillery units arrived on the newly captured beaches, dragging massive 105mm and 155mm howitzers through the surf. By nightfall, the Americans had established a massive, heavily fortified artillery base on these adjacent islets. They set up their fire direction centers, plotted the coordinates of every known Japanese bunker on the main island, and loaded their guns. Suddenly, the fatal flaw of the Japanese water's edge defense was mercilessly exposed. The Japanese had built their pillboxes to face outward, heavily armoring the front walls pointing toward the ocean, while leaving the rear entrances lightly protected or completely open to the lagoon side to allow for the resupply of ammunition. Now, as the sun rose on the morning of the main invasion, the American artillery base on the adjacent islets opened fire. They were not shooting from the ocean. They were firing directly across the calm waters of the lagoon, calculating the trajectory to strike the Japanese defenses from behind. The Japanese garrison, already reeling from the naval bombardment, suddenly found heavy 105mm artillery shells slamming into the unarmored rear doors of their bunkers, detonating deep inside the concrete chambers. The defenders were caught in a geographically inescapable crossfire. They were being systematically outflanked and dismantled by mathematics and artillery before a single American infantryman had even set foot on the main invasion beaches. Then came the mechanical solution to the coral reef, the tactical nightmare that had haunted the American military since Tarawa. On the morning of February 1st, as the main assault waves formed up in the staging areas offshore, the Japanese gunners, who had survived the devastating artillery crossfire, wiped the thick layer of coral dust from their optics and looked out toward the sea. They saw the landing craft approaching. They gripped the triggers of their remaining heavy machine guns, checking their ammunition belts, and waited for the familiar, fatal sequence to unfold. They waited for the boats to strike the edge of the fringing reef, for the heavy steel ramps to drop, and for the vulnerable American infantry to step out into the deep water. But the familiar flat-bottomed Higgins boats did not lead the charge. They halted far out at sea, bobbing safely in the deep ocean swells. From the bellies of the larger landing ships emerged a completely different kind of machine, the LVT, the landing vehicle, tracked. Known to the troops as the Amtrak, these strange, low-slung mechanical beasts churned through the surf, emitting a loud, guttural roar from their heavy radial engines. As they reached the treacherous edge of the coral reef, the Japanese gunners braced themselves, fully expecting the vehicles to grind to a sudden, violent halt. They did not stop. The heavy, continuous steel tracks of the LVTs bit deep into the jagged coral rock. Acting like massive mechanical claws, the treads found traction on the submerged reef. Slowly, relentlessly, the Amtraks rose up out of the ocean, shedding sheets of seawater, and crawled directly onto the dry stone of the reef. The Japanese defenders stared in absolute shock through the smoke, as dozens, then hundreds of these armored vehicles simply bypassed the natural barrier that was supposed to be the foundation of their entire defensive strategy. The Amtraks drove steadily across the shallow reef, their mounted machine guns laying down a heavy volume of suppressive fire, and did not stop until their tracks hit the soft, dry sand of the beaches. The ocean trap had been completely neutralized by American engineering. The doctrine of stopping the enemy on the reef disintegrated in a matter of minutes, leaving the surviving Japanese defenders staring directly into the armored faces of an invading force that had arrived entirely intact. As the heavy steel ramps of the LVTs lowered onto the dry sand, releasing thousands of American soldiers from the 7th Infantry Division on Kwajalein and the 4th Marine Division in the north on Roy Namur, a profound and terrifying shift in battlefield tempo occurred. The Japanese defenders, clinging to the shattered remnants of their shallow trench lines, braced themselves for a massive, chaotic infantry rush. They expected the Americans to charge blindly forward with fixed bayonets, presenting a dense, moving target that could be cut down by the surviving machine gun nests. But the American commanders had absorbed the bitter lessons of the previous year. They had drilled a new, uncompromising rhythm into their men, a rhythm defined by agonizing mechanical patience. There would be no reckless heroics on the beaches of Kwajalein. There would be no unsupported frontal assaults against fortified positions. The American infantry advanced with the slow, deliberate pace of an industrial assembly line. Moving through the dense smoke and the shattered trunks of the palm trees, the soldiers and Marines maintained a strict tactical formation. When a concealed Japanese machine gun suddenly opened fire from a surviving coconut log bunker, pinning down a squad in the sand, the American infantry did not attempt to overwhelm the position with sheer numbers. They simply stopped. They dropped to the ground, took cover behind the pulverized debris of the naval bombardment, and reached for the heavy handsets of their SCR-300 backpack radios. They communicated with the mechanized armor waiting just behind the front line. Within minutes, the deep, rumbling sound of a massive Sherman M4 medium tank or a heavily armed 75mm half-track could be heard moving up through the sand. The infantry would patiently lay down a curtain of suppressive rifle fire, keeping the Japanese gunners pinned inside their bunker, while the Sherman tank casually rolled forward until it was practically at point-blank range. The tank commander would slowly traverse the turret, lower the 75mm main gun until it was aimed directly at the narrow firing slit of the Japanese pillbox, and pull the trigger. The high explosive round would detonate inside the confined space, instantly silencing the weapon and ending the threat. If the terrain prevented a tank from moving up, the infantry called upon the offshore destroyers, utilizing dedicated naval gunfire liaison officers to walk heavy artillery shells precisely onto the target, sometimes within a few dozen yards of their own positions. If the concrete was too thick, or the position too deeply buried beneath the sand, the infantry turned to the combat engineers. Operating under the tight, synchronized covering fire of their squads, engineers equipped with heavy, canvas-strapped flamethrowers would low-crawl toward the blind spots of the bunker. A brief, terrifying burst of liquid fire would suck the oxygen from the structure, instantly neutralizing the defenders inside. This was immediately followed by a demolition man hurling a canvas satchel charge, packed with high explosives, directly into the ventilation shaft or the rear entrance, blowing the heavy concrete roof into the sky. It was a cold, clinical, and relentless process. Step forward, halt under fire, call for mechanized support, execute the destruction of the obstacle, and step forward again. The American war machine simply refused to bleed unnecessarily. They substituted the expenditure of human lives with the massive, overwhelming expenditure of high explosives and diesel fuel. For the Japanese garrison, this slow, methodical grind was a psychological and tactical nightmare. They found themselves trapped in a terrifying geographic vice because their entire defensive strategy relied on stopping the Americans at the water's edge, and because the island was incredibly narrow, they possessed absolutely no spatial depth to conduct a fighting retreat. They could not pull back to a secondary line in the dense jungle because there was no dense jungle behind them. They could not retreat to higher ground because the highest elevation on the entire atoll was barely a dozen feet above sea level. They were pinned in place, squeezed relentlessly between the advancing wall of American infantry and tanks pushing from the beaches and the continuous rain of heavy artillery shells still pouring in from the adjacent islets across the lagoon. Any attempt to launch a localized counterattack was instantly shredded. When small groups of Japanese soldiers, driven by desperation and the rigid demands of their warrior code, charged out of the smoke with drawn swords and fixed bayonets, they did not engage the Americans in hand-to-hand combat. They were instantly cut to pieces by an impenetrable wall of interlocking, synchronized fire from the Sherman tanks, the advancing Amtraks, and the disciplined ranks of the infantry. The Japanese officers were systematically killed, leaving the confused, terrified Korean laborers and displaced aviation mechanics entirely leaderless, caught in a mechanized crossfire they had never been trained to understand. By February 4th, just days after the first LVTs had crawled across the reef, the systematic elimination of the Kwajalein garrison was complete. The once impregnable fortress had been reduced to a flattened, smoldering wasteland of shattered concrete, splintered palm logs, and pulverized white coral. The tactical geometry of the island had been completely erased by the overwhelming kinetic force of the American assault. The operation was a flawless mechanical triumph, validating every single painful lesson extracted from the disaster of the previous year. The amphibious doctrine had been perfected, transforming the United States military into an unstoppable, continent-hopping machine capable of projecting overwhelming force across the deepest oceans. Yet, as the smoke drifted away from the shattered bunkers and the casualty reports were finalized, this absolute clinical perfection set into motion a profound strategic paradox. The American victory at Kwajalein was so overwhelmingly effective, so geometrically flawless, and so completely undeniable in its execution that it stripped away every illusion the Japanese high command still harbored about defending the Pacific. The news of the atoll's rapid, mechanical annihilation reached the strategic planners in Tokyo, and it triggered a massive, terrifying realization that would completely alter the trajectory of the war. They understood instantly that the doctrine of the water's edge was not merely flawed against this new, fully evolved American war machine, it was a rapid, guaranteed suicide pact. The perfect American victory had inadvertently provided the Japanese with a flawless diagnostic of their own fatal weaknesses. To survive the coming onslaught, to make the Americans bleed for every yard of the home islands, Tokyo realized they had to abandon the beaches entirely. They had to go deep underground, into the volcanic rock and the limestone caves, setting the stage for a new, unimaginably brutal phase of the Pacific conflict that would soon turn islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa into sprawling, subterranean slaughterhouses. The smoke had barely cleared from the shattered coral of Kwajalein when the American military command immediately began to codify the aftermath. There was no time for widespread celebration. Instead, while the island was still smoldering, intelligence officers and tactical planners walked the pulverized beaches, interviewing platoon leaders, tank commanders, and exhausted riflemen. They were cementing a new, uncompromising law of the Pacific theater. The only tragedy worse than losing men in combat was paying in blood for the exact same tactical mistake twice. The meticulous mechanical formula executed over the past 4 days, the extended naval bombardment, the seizure of adjacent islands for artillery bases, the deployment of tracked amphibious armor, and the deliberate, synchronized advance of infantry and tanks was permanently locked in as the gold standard for all future amphibious operations. The United States had built the perfect island-killing machine, but back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz looked at the sprawling map of the Central Pacific and extracted an even more devastating strategic lesson. If the American fleet could completely obliterate the administrative and military heart of the Marshall Islands with such clinical precision, they did not actually need to waste time or lives assaulting the rest of the archipelago. Nimitz made a cold, calculated decision that fundamentally accelerated the war. He ordered his task forces to simply sail right past the remaining heavily garrisoned outer atolls, including Wacha, Maloelap, and Jaluit. With a single operational directive, approximately 13,700 Imperial Japanese troops were instantly neutralized, without a single American shot being fired. They were entirely cut off from the Empire. There would be no glorious final stand for these garrisons, no heroic defense of the beaches. Tokyo had no supply convoys or transport ships left to evacuate them, and the American command saw absolutely zero strategic value in fighting them. Instead, for the next 18 months, those 13,000 trapped soldiers were simply bypassed by a war that no longer cared they existed. They were condemned to slowly die from severe malnutrition, rampant tropical diseases, and agonizing isolation. Yet the most dangerous consequence of the 4-day slaughter on Kwajalein was not American. It was unfolding thousands of miles away, deep inside the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Japanese strategists meticulously analyzed the fragmented radio intercepts, the frantic final dispatches, and the horrifying silence that followed the American invasion. The psychological shock within the high command was profound. The illusion of their foundational defensive doctrine was shattered permanently. The realization was as clear as it was terrifying. Massing their forces at the water's edge to face the ungodly, concentrated weight of the United States Navy was no longer a viable defense. It was collective, state-mandated suicide. The Americans had just mathematically proven that they possessed the industrial and kinetic power to physically erase any coastline on Earth. If the Imperial Army continued to meet the enemy on the beaches, the Empire would be annihilated. A desperate, fundamental evolution was required. To survive, the Japanese military had to completely invert their entire philosophy of island warfare. By the spring of 1944, top-tier Japanese commanders began drafting a series of radical new directives behind closed doors. These new orders would demand a total abandonment of conventional military pride. The objective would no longer be to repel the Americans at the beach, nor to win the battle at all. The new objective was simply to manipulate time and maximize American casualties. A dark, meticulous blueprint was being finalized, one that was about to completely change how the rest of the war would be fought. In the spring of 1944, a highly classified document began circulating through the highest echelons of the Imperial Japanese Army. It was the direct, terrifying answer to the ashes of Kwajalein. Drafted by the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, this new doctrinal blueprint fundamentally rewrote the rules of island defense. The directive was absolute. The era of Mizugiwa Sakusen, the strategy of stopping the enemy at the water's edge, was officially over. Japanese commanders were ordered to abandon the beaches entirely. They were to concede the shoreline, allow the Americans to land their tanks and infantry unimpeded, and let the initial wave of naval bombardment fall harmlessly on empty sand. But the new orders demanded a cultural shift even more radical than the tactical one. Tokyo explicitly banned the banzai charge. For years, the massed, suicidal infantry assault had been the spiritual core of the Japanese military ethos, a glorious, final act of defiance when defeat was inevitable. Now, it was officially condemned as a selfish waste of military resources. A soldier throwing away his life in a rapid, dramatic death at the hands of an American machine gun was no longer an act of honor, it was a failure of duty. The new mandate was chillingly pragmatic. Every single soldier was ordered to stay alive as long as physically possible, solely to kill Americans. The goal was no longer to win the battle, because Tokyo secretly acknowledged the battles could no longer be won. The sole objective was to inflict such a staggering, excruciating level of attrition that the American public would eventually lose the political will to continue the war. To achieve this agonizing delay, the Japanese army vanished from the surface of the earth. Across the Pacific, military engineers discarded their designs for shallow sand bunkers and began looking deep into the volcanic rock and ancient limestone of the inner island chains. They initiated the construction of the most elaborate, deeply entrenched subterranean defense networks in military history. Entire garrisons were ordered to take their heavy weapons, their ammunition, and their hospitals and carry them deep underground. They carved out miles of interconnected caves, multi-level subterranean tunnels, and hidden pillboxes that were practically impervious to the heaviest American naval artillery. The firing ports of these new bunkers no longer faced out toward the open ocean. Instead, they were angled precisely inward, designed to interlock with a dozen other hidden positions, creating devastating kill zones in the rugged interior of the islands. The purest, most lethal expression of this new doctrine would soon be realized by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. When he arrived to command the defense of Iwo Jima in the summer of 1944, Kuribayashi meticulously studied the autopsy reports of the Marshall Islands. He looked at the flat, exposed beaches where Admiral Akiyama's garrison had been rapidly annihilated, and he immediately ordered his men into the dark, volcanic ash of Mount Suribachi. Over the grueling months that followed, he engineered an invisible, subterranean fortress of 11 miles of tunnels, explicitly designed to deny the Americans the quick, mechanized victory they had perfected at Kwajalein. A few months later, on the island of Okinawa, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima would take this exact same blueprint and scale it into a massive, island-wide subterranean defense known as the Shuri Line, forcing the Americans into months of nightmarish, point-blank attrition. The Americans had built a flawless machine for destroying targets they could see. In response, the Japanese military simply decided to become invisible. The paradox of Kwajalein was now fully weaponized. As the United States Fifth Fleet sailed westward across the Pacific, its commanders were supremely confident, trusting implicitly in the clinical, overpowering amphibious system they had forged in the Marshalls. They had no idea that their perfect victory had just thoroughly educated their enemy. They did not know that by showing Tokyo exactly how they destroyed coastal fortresses, they had inadvertently forced the creation of a subterranean nightmare. The Americans were moving relentlessly closer to the Japanese home islands, entirely unaware of the horrific butcher's bill that was quietly waiting for them in the dark. The true legacy of Kwajalein is not found in the mechanics of its victory, but in the brutal mathematics of what followed. It cost the United States exactly 372 lives to annihilate a garrison of nearly 8,000 men. But that stunning, lopsided ratio would never be repeated. Because the enemy absorbed the lesson so thoroughly, those 372 dead on Kwajalein would ultimately give way to 6,821 Americans killed in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. Months later, the subterranean labyrinth of Okinawa would claim the lives of over 12,000 more. Looking back at this horrific escalation, it is tempting to view the overwhelming display of force in the Marshall Islands as a moment when the United States showed its hand too early. But the flawless assault on Kwajalein was not a mistake. It was an absolute operational necessity. It proved the trauma of Tarawa had been conquered. It validated the armored amphibious tractors, the extended naval bombardments, and the methodical synchronization of infantry and tanks. This triumph tore the outer perimeter of the Japanese Empire wide open, clearing the path westward and vastly accelerating the American drive across the Pacific. Yet, the dark reality of the campaign remains buried in the pulverized ruins of the atoll. If we return to that shattered concrete bunker on the southern edge of Kwajalein Island, the exact spot where a sudden naval shell abruptly ended the life of Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama before the invasion even began, we see the terrifying paradox of the battle in its purest form. Akiyama and his men were erased with such clinical, undeniable precision that it left the high command in Tokyo with absolutely no illusions. The Japanese could not blame the rapid loss of the island on poor morale or a tactical fluke. They were forced to look at the sheer superiority of the American amphibious machine and recognize that any defense built on the surface of the Earth was doomed to immediate vaporization. By executing a masterpiece of coastal destruction, the Americans inadvertently provided the Imperial Japanese Army with a flawless diagnostic of their own vulnerabilities. The absolute perfection of the American assault left Tokyo with only one possible evolutionary path: to abandon the light of day and drag the war down into the dark. It leaves behind a lingering, uncomfortable question about the true nature of overwhelming military triumph. When an army wins a battle too flawlessly and too convincingly, does it actually bring the conflict to a faster close? Or does it merely offer a terrifyingly clear education to a desperate enemy, teaching them exactly how to make the victor pay an unimaginable price in the campaigns yet to come? The shattered concrete of Kwajalein provides the definitive, chilling answer. In the broader scope of history, overwhelming triumphs are almost always celebrated as the beginning of the end. Yet, the paradox of the Marshall Islands proves that absolute dominance can sometimes become a trap in disguise. By executing an amphibious masterclass, by erasing a coastal garrison so clinically that resistance became mathematically impossible, the United States did not break the fighting spirit of the Japanese Empire. They simply stripped away its last tactical illusions. They handed a desperate enemy a flawless, fatal diagnosis of their own weakness, entirely free of charge. And in doing so, they guaranteed that the road to Tokyo would no longer be fought on sunlit beaches, but down in the dark, bleeding volcanic rock of a subterranean hell, forcing the victor to buy their own lessons back in the currency of thousands of American lives.